This is such a beautiful passage, and I thought you might enjoy reading it with me. And so we're going to read it responsively. If you look in your hymnal in the back at number 701, it's entitled Faith, Hope, and Love. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not love, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal.
And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I can remove mountains, and have not love, I am nothing.
And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not love, it profiteth me nothing.
Love suffereth long, and is kind. Love envieth not.
Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Love never faileth.
But whether there be
Prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. And now abideth faith, hope, love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. I've told you a little bit about the church that I'm about to talk about. Told you a little bit about them before. It was a church I served a good while back in California. 250 and more people. I don't know, just a huge sanctuary full of people in the beginning. They had a choir ministry like you wouldn't believe. They had all the different age-graded choirs, had big Easter and Christmas performances, and lots of quartets and ensembles, and even a drama troupe as well, and a fully graded Sunday school, lots of wonderful teaching, and every year a great big vacation Bible school for a week. They had a large youth group. That was my bailiwick, and we had about 40 kids around there all the time, and loads of activities. Many, many ministries happening from the church. Lots of wonderful things. A great facility, great location. We used to always say just 2 miles from the San Diego Zoo. And some wonderful, wonderful Christian people who Keith and I are indebted to. But nearly every business meeting was going to end in fighting, it seemed. There were these really strong ministries, as I've described, but others who weren't in those ministries, but they were in another ministry. There was always vying for who got the priority. And there was a lot of problem with the music ministry because of how powerful it was. Oh, but they need to do this and they need to do that. They get too much money. Vying for the limelight. Critical spirit set in there. Meanness. And then I told you this. Some people, hopefully just a few people. But you knew it was happening. They were sending their tithe to the former pastor who had moved to Irvine, to another church. Today, there is no First Southern Baptist Church of San Diego. There's a church there. Another church bought the building. I last heard that they were doing pretty well. But no more of the church that we were at. 1 Corinthians 13, it's often used as a wedding passage. You probably thought of a wedding as we read it together a short time ago. We just equate it with all things romantic. Because our culture basically is obsessed with romance. But Paul wasn't writing to a bunch of people in love. Paul was writing to a bunch of people who had forgotten about love, about its importance, about how they needed to make it first. They were like my church in California. You know, churches close their doors for many reasons, but one that will absolutely guarantee that the doors are going to close is if they forget about how important it is to love. So let's think about this church at Corinth that Paul was writing to. They had all kinds of divisions. If you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he talks about boasting. Chapter 4, he talks about a lot of hypocrisy and pride. And then chapter 12, he talks about how they quarrel, as we've said last week, over the importance of various spiritual gifts, or who taught them. You know, I am of Apollos. He's the one who taught me. Well, I'm of Paul. He's the one who taught me. So that makes me better. I'm better informed. Well, I speak in tongues. Well, I don't speak in tongues, but I can preach. Well, I can't preach, but I can teach. And on it went. Instead of valuing each other's gifts and leaning on each other for what each other could provide and working together as a finely oiled machine, no. It became all about hierarchy, vying for importance. They forgot that they were to do what they did for the common good. That everything that they were able to do, all the gifts the Spirit had given them, were to be used together for the common good. Paul wrote them to say, look, there's something more important than all the gifts. The gifts are a great blessing. And Paul, we know, spoke in tongues. He tells us that. It was his prayer language. But he says there are so much more important things. In fact, one thing that is more important than all of them, and that's love. Love makes everything else worth whatever it can be worth. But without it, it makes it worthless. He says if you have great speaking gifts, you can preach and shake the roof, shake the timbers of the building, but you don't have love. It's just irritating noise. You can speak in angelic speech. Now, when they would imagine what the most glorious speech would be, the most beautiful, inspiring speech, they would think of it in terms of the language of angels. And you know, Paul at one point in his letters, he talks about being caught up to heaven. Whether it was a vision or reality, he's not sure, but he was caught up to heaven and heard things no human is allowed to speak. So he's thinking of that. That's powerful speech too, that heavenly language. But he says all of it would be worth nothing if love was not at the heart of it, if love was not why it was spoken. He says all knowledge and ability to teach or preach with excellence and all faith as to move mountains. That's the kind of faith, remember, Jesus talked about. If you have faith, even a mustard seed, you can say to that mountain, crumble and fall in the sea. Well, not if you don't have love, Paul says. It's not just faith. There has to be love. All is vain without love. It might inform, but it's not going to change anything. Great acts of giving, too. We think of how many people throughout Christian history, even to this day, face possible death on a daily or maybe even moment-by-moment basis. But if they're not there out of love for God, if they're not there to give themselves away for the sake of that love, for the people that they bring it to, it's worth nothing. Paul said that love was the most excellent way. And not only that it's the only way. But you know, love isn't easy, is it? There are some 7.7 billion people in this world right now with talents and abilities as unique as each person is. For Christians, those talents become spirit enacted, and they are meant to be a great blessing for the work of his church, a treasure amongst themselves and in the world. But you know, in the world, Jesus talked about it, how the Gentiles, he said, love to lord it over one another, to be served, to have power over each other, to create jealousies and hierarchies and division. But not you, Paul says, not you. He said if Christians operate like that, they won't have any power to do anything that Jesus has given them to do in this world. Well, what is this love? Paul goes on to describe the love, the agape love in the Greek of God, the unconditional, completely unselfish love of God. If you've been to any wedding I've officiated, you've heard me say this, that in this world, people take great pains, especially in our culture, to make themselves lovable instead of loving. And so, you know, the biggest thing, you can see it all over the commercials, change your appearance, change your outward appearance. Use this makeup, use this hairstyle, wear these clothes, use this diet program, use this exercise machine, use all these things to make yourself more lovable. But Paul says no. He would say to that, the focus is all wrong. It needs to be on seeking for the good of the other and not what we can get by making ourselves more attractive. He says that this love only originates in God. It's only possible through God. We love as we allow God's Spirit to love through us. And so, you know what? It's not really natural at all. And when we say things like, well, you know, I can't turn my feelings on and off like a faucet, God's not interested very much at all in our feelings. God's interested in what's at the motivation of what we do. is because our deepest desire is to love God by doing the acts of God, by doing the will of God for the blessing of people in this world, like Jesus lived. I'm sure that there were many things Jesus did while he was here that he knew, and chief among them being go to the cross, would be horrifically painful, would be, at the very least, not at all pleasurable. But he was not about what would serve himself, what would please himself, about being lovable. He was about loving with every fiber of his being. And that's what he calls us to. Something we cannot do. Something that's utterly impossible for us to do without the Spirit doing it through us. But the Spirit will do it through us if we will yield, if we will ask, if we will seek it, instead of being concerned about self. Let's think about God's agape, what it does. As the choir sang, love is patient. And I think the best way to summarize that is just to say, it doesn't have a last nerve to get on. It just doesn't. It doesn't have one. It's going to hang in there. It's going to take a deep breath. It's going to keep smiling. It is kind. It's good-natured. It's gentle. It's affectionate, considerate, those kinds of things. It protects people's feelings. It speaks the truth, yes, but with love. Paul wrote that. Speak the truth in love. It isn't jealous. It's zealously for others. It rejoices, as we'll read in a few moments, when someone has a good thing, a blessing, fall into their laps. It doesn't brag. It doesn't try to grab the attention or the power, the center. It isn't a windbag. It isn't proud. It doesn't act superior. Look down its nose at someone. It lifts up. It brags on others. It isn't rude. It doesn't enjoy being blunt. You know people that enjoy being blunt? You know, they say, well, I'm just telling it like it is. That's not what love does. It doesn't verbalize every thought either. It has tact. And it isn't selfish. It doesn't seek its own happiness exclusively or mainly or to the hurt of anyone else. It isn't possessive, controlling, manipulating, demanding, dominating. It's giving. It listens. It puts others' needs first. You know, a good while back, someone showed me a copy of the Satanic Bible by Anton LaVey. And I was curious how it might open. What would be the first words? What in the world would this person have written? And do you know the opening premise, and really the whole premise behind it, as far as I could see, was that we worship Satan, that we worship self, that we take care of self. Anton LaVey maintains, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. Putting yourself first, living for yourself, that's what everybody wants to do anyway. Go with it. You're just being honest. That's how that book opens. It isn't easily irritated. It's not prone to angry outbursts. It's restrained. It controls its strong emotions, whether in words or actions. It isn't resentful. It doesn't hold a grudge. It doesn't, as I've so often heard, get historical. Not hysterical. Historical. It doesn't hold on to, but yeah, remember. Remember when you did. It isn't touchy. It isn't malicious or judgmental. Love forgives. And it doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing. It isn't happy to see the faults or the guilt that is in someone else. It doesn't have one of those, aha, I knew it. I knew they were like that. Didn't I tell you they were like that? It rejoices in the truth. It rejoices in the virtues of others. Paul goes on in his final words, it bears all things. Literally, it covers all things like a roof. It covers imperfections. It doesn't notice nor does it try to avenge wrongs or faults of others. It goes the extra mile to protect someone's reputation. It believes all things, but not naively. It just looks for the best and believes it. It hopes all things. Hopes all will turn out well. Hopes that once everything is known in the situation, there will be peace. It's not pessimistic because it believes in the love of God. It endures all things. Now, that doesn't mean that it allows itself to continually be abused. Don't hear that. No. What that means is it keeps on. It makes me think of in John 13 where Jesus, right before he washed his disciples' feet, it says, Jesus loved his disciples and he loved them to the end. Again, it is only possible by the Spirit as we give the Spirit room to work in us. And so here is the triumph of love when we do that. Here is its power. It works everywhere. Love does. Works everywhere. In every culture, in every place on this planet, love works. It's adaptable to all circumstances. It never runs out. It never gets used up, or it never ends. Ironically, it's the one thing we keep by giving it away. And it always changes things. Have you seen love change things? It always changes things. It is the greatest power. I think about stories of the early Christians while the world in Europe, they were all running away from the bubonic plague, but Christians were running to those folks who were ill, trying to minister and do what they could. What about us? What about you and me? We think about, too, when we lose a loved one, one day it will be us. What will be said of our love on that day? Love is our legacy. It is our legacy as a church, too. What does this community now say about the love of Pocahontas-Bassett Baptist Church? What will it say? If we make love our highest goal, if we do love, if we don't forget its importance, if we pray for God's love to rule in us and we stir it up, and we remember that it's measured best by its capacity to endure tension and in disagreement. Because as we move into our future and we make decisions and we do bold things, we have different gifts, we have different ideas, experiences, priorities, so many differences. Remember, they're a blessing. And remember that as we disagree, if we remember love, they will be a blessing, those differences. If we do love, especially when it feels strange or inconvenient, that's when you really got to do it. If we rise to Paul's challenge, don't just pretend to love others, really love them. Lay down your life for them as Christ did. If we do those things, we'll be faithful. And God will create in this place a place for his glory. I see it now. I see it for our future. I close with this story. During World War II, the British military on the European continent, the English citizens as well, they were forced to flee to the French coast to escape the Germans, and so they went to the French coast of Dunkirk, or town, and there the British Army fought the Germans, but it was a losing battle, and they were threatened, and they were about to be driven into the sea, so Churchill ordered that everything that floated, any kind of seagoing vessel, would go over there to rescue those British folks there at Dunkirk. And so every available seagoing vessel went. And as they were approaching Dunkirk, the Nazi aircraft pummeled them with artillery shells. And many ships right there were blown apart. 3 German aircraft hit a cruise liner that they were using to rescue people, the Lancastria. Nearly 200 men were trapped in its hold. Everyone knew the ship was going to sink. There was chaos and smoke and oil and fire and blood and terrified cries of men trapped in the hold below. But moving through that nightmare, there was a young Navy chaplain. He made his way to the edge of that hold, and he peered down into those fearful eyes. And then, knowing he'd never get out, he jumped in. Survivors later told how the only thing that gave them the courage to survive was hearing the brave men in the hold singing hymns until the ship finally rolled over and sunk into the deep. One faithful Christian who loved with the love of Christ, who loved with self-sacrificial laying down of his life, is a great example for us of the kind of love that we're called to, the kind of love that the Lord will provide through us if we allow it. What about you? This morning, the invitation is this. Come in any way the Lord leads you, but I want to say this to you. If you are considering this church as your church home, know this is a place of love, of God's love. You will not find judgment here. You will not find strife of any kind. Praise God. You will find a home if you're looking for one. And so I encourage you to come if that's the way the Lord's leading you. Maybe you have never committed your life to Christ. Don't delay. Come this morning with that decision, surely. And I'll be here at the front to receive you as you come, as we sing. This is hymn 376.